You won't hear this in any marketing books, but story comes before strategy. You won't hear this in any marketing books, but it's not about total available market, TAM. It's about total imaginable.
Hi, and welcome to the June podcast. I'm your host, Enzo, co-founder at June. In this show, I'm talking to the most inspiring product and growth leaders out there who will share their tips on how to launch and grow your SaaS. No fuss, no BS. I hope you enjoyed the show. So hi, James, and welcome to the podcast. How are things?
They're excellent. Yeah, I'm jumping around Europe right now from one country to another. And it's fantastic. Such a rich... I live in the US now, so it's just so great to be reminded of cultural diversity and the sort of variety and diversity of people's lives and approaches to the world. And that's observation of humankind for me is always helps in storytelling, which is what I do. So traveling is good.
I love that. You're such a curious person. And we're going to touch on that in a second. So I'm really excited to have you here to chat, as you said, about writing, building great stories and narratives for brands. A little bit about yourself. You worked alongside Steve Jobs, building Apple's narrative for 11 years. I checked before, and what I learned is that you initially worked from TBWA, the advertising agency, and then you actually helped build Media Arts Lab, which was the worldwide agency fully dedicated to Apple.
Right.
So during your time at Apple, you worked on the launch of amazing products like iTunes, iPod, iPhones, iPad, app stores, many, many more. And we're going to go through that in a second. Since then, you've created your own structure. I couldn't find a name how to define it. I call it a next generation agency. How do you call it?
Not typically an agency, but yeah, it's a peer-to-peer storytelling consultancy, I guess. I mean, we just work directly with founders, which is what I did with Steve, and then I did with Brian Chesky and Evan Spiegel at Snapchat. And so that personal interaction, I have 3 partners. We all come in. We do this sort of narrative therapy approach of provoking and telling stories and building strategy and pulling the genius out of great founders that want to change the world, figuring out how they can help others see the way that they see the world that's different from today. Because it's sometimes founders are really good at building the products and they have the vision themselves, but they aren't necessarily good at communicating to others how to get there. What are the steps to get there, to imagining the world a different way, that their product is going to be, resonant with it.
So that's really what you do. And I think you put that in a beautiful way already. You're amplifying kind of the founders you help. Is this correct?
Yeah, I mean, amplification is one, I think, look, typically we're working with incredibly smart founders that have almost idealistic ideas for how to change the world. And our job is to lay the track, just sequence the language that gets people to understand it, And so sometimes they're very complex. Our job is to find the familiar way for people to understand that way of looking at the world. That these massive transformations, if we had a lot of time, I could tell you the transformation of the music industry from people not paying for money for music and artists not being paid, then introducing iTunes, 99 cents for your favorite song, iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Very simple ideas. You go, oh, I will pay for music and I will enjoy and love my music again and take it with me. 1,000 songs in your pocket. I mean, I know it doesn't sound too many now, but back then when you had 12 that skipped in your pocket, then it was amazing. So that's just a little example of you look at the world one way and you say, well, people will never pay for music again, right? Napster, LimeWire, the record industry is suing 13-year-olds, it's done. When does anything go from free to being paid for? When it's beautifully and elegantly presented, when the experience is so awesome, you're willing to pay 99 cents for your favorite song. You want to pay $300 for an iPod, which is the coolest device ever. So then, a phone went from having all these buttons and a tiny screen, people not caring about the phone. You'd say, what's your phone? And you go, I don't know, I have whatever, Verizon in America or AT&T or whatever, But that's not the answer to the question, that the changing what a phone is. You remove the buttons. The first thing that humans said were, where are the buttons? What's this screen? What do I do? Right? So again, I'm totally reimagining something that no one, it's that question in 1900, if you'd asked people what they want, they would have said a faster horse. You go, okay, Now, how do I introduce this idea of a car when no one's ever thought of a car before? Like, what are the ways in which every color as long as it's black? And so, you have to create sort of familiarity in that journey. Since we're in it, like the iPhone, right? As you introduce a supercomputer in your pocket, which is the iPhone, people are like, well, a phone is this thing with loads of buttons, right? And a little screen, and I make phone calls and do texting. And you're like, well, no, it's really can become a supercomputer in your pocket. So really more a computational and creative device, but you call it the iPhone because that's familiar, So oftentimes when you're trying to invent and leap to some interpretation of a world that people haven't seen before, you need to look for the familiar. I think new on top of new is always something Steve would warn us about. It's like, don't do that. No, all people always say, I'll do that next year. New on top of new is like, nah, I'll wait for other people to do that first. So there's an app for that was actually the solution to, your phone, right? Your phone has all of these apps on it, right? So if you look at everybody's phone, it looks like that, right? It's a Swiss Army knife. What do you want to do today, right? Oh, I want to do this. There's an app for that. I want to get my hair cut. There's an app for that. I want to fly to London. There's an app for that. I want to buy a t-shirt. There's an app. There's an app for just about anything on the iPhone. So that was what Apple did to introduce for 5 years, just new apps, and you know all about that, but created the platform upon which everybody developed. And it was in your pocket, and it was a supercomputer, and it's super easy to use, and there is nothing but a screen. And that was a massive reinterpretation of something. A phone for 100 years looked a certain way. It was kind of dialing and saying hello. And suddenly the phone goes to a supercomputer. And so you need language to make that sort of long arc storytelling make sense. And you need to introduce it through the lens of the familiar. So I think Apple is always using incredibly simple, almost inevitable language. Sometimes I think people want to find this crazy way to market something, which maybe sometimes that works. But for me, I think it's about understanding the human condition, understanding where you're trying to go, and finding ways that you can bring people along so they understand increasingly your version of where the world can be. And those are the most interesting founders. Like our company founder, we couldn't have all the vowels such as FNDR. Founders come out of the woodwork all the time and say, James, we need to work together. And they come with a sort of, I see the world this way. Or I ask them, how do you see the world? And then we say, okay, well, let's think about where the world is today and how people think about that category. We're going to have to recalibrate, rethink what that is and tell stories to bring people along. It's no good you seeing it and other people not seeing it. That's where storytelling comes in.
Did you know that from the beginning, or was there any kind of epiphany moment, maybe with Apple, that led you to that? Because now it seems so obvious when you say it, but I've never learned that in any marketing books when I was in college.
No, right? I'm always saying you won't hear this in any marketing books, but story comes before strategy. You won't hear this in any marketing books, but it's not about total available market, TAM. It's about total imaginable. If you're really trying to reimagine something, you have to imagine how that category would be recreated, and then imagine what that market is. We're not McKinsey, although we partner with them sometimes, but they're, and we joke, we're about TIM, the total imaginable market, and McKinsey is about total available market. Like, innovation for them is, how do I stretch existing markets? And they're a wonderful company. I don't want to be on the wrong side of that conversation. I think I'm talking to him tomorrow, which is why it came up. But
they do a different job, I think.
Yeah, no, and quite complementary in many ways. So, back to your question. It's a great question, actually. Thank you. So, how do I disentangle, for 11 years, every Wednesday from 1 till 3, I chaired a meeting with Steve. And every day talked to him multiple times, email, whatever, texting, whatever the communication platform was at the beginning. It didn't have an iPhone, so it was texting, and then obviously it changed. But I think I had some of these things in my head, not fully formalized. And then, of course, I had the greatest master of all time, who was incredibly clear on when it was working and when it wasn't, on things to do and things not to do. And so you learn quickly. And then I think after a short period of time, I realized that my job, and I think this is probably the practice that I've learned to do with other founders, is kind of be the alchemist around a founder. So I'll find the founder, figure out how to pull the genius out of them, like prod them a little bit, ask them, punchy, fun questions about how, and they say things, and I say, yeah, but what about that? And they go say things, and what about, so a little bit cheeky English guy, and just sort of prod them a little bit, and they say stuff, and I said, no, but what about that? No, but that, there you go. So there's a little of that, we call it narrative therapy a little bit of the sort of like pulling it out, and I go, okay, that's the hypothesis. Let's work on that. Let's dig into that. Let's explore it. And so what I realized my role was with Steve every Wednesday was to bring stimulus, to pull the genius out of him, show him ideas, words, visuals, lines, strategies, draw charts on so he could redraw them. I mean, literally, I had all of these slides and charts, and I would bring them and draw on the board, and he'd be like, oh, James, give me the pen. That's not it. It's that. And I'm like, yes. I have to get it almost right. Otherwise, I'm an idiot. But, it's like, no, it's going to take, we can get there in 3 years, not 5. Or, no, that middle section doesn't work. I think it's this. Or, I like that, but this doesn't work. Okay, good. So you throw those ideas. They have to be pretty good ideas. Otherwise, you're an idiot. But you throw good ideas, and then a smart founder interacts with those ideas. And then, I'm a bit of an oralist. So you say something, I say something, we say something, and we go back and forth, ping pong. It gets better and better initiative. And I say, okay, let's stop. This is where we're at. And then I say, let's talk next week. And the critical thing, another piece of the practice is, next week I go, oh, hi, Enzo, good to see you. Let's get back into it. So when we last were talking, there were 3 things that we talked about. We talked about this and about the role of narrative and imagining a world you've never seen before in inevitable language. Cool. Okay, let's get back into it. It's like as if it's one conversation. And that discipline of, even though you go away, you come back and you stay on track in a sort of really focused sprint, either with 2 or with a small number of people really dedicated to that project. That's how you get from good to good to good to great, right? And I know Apple is famous for its sort of reps. It has this cadence of product teams meeting. We'd have like 9 months ahead of a product launch. We'd meet every month about something. And then 6 months ahead, it'd be every 2 weeks. And then 3 months ahead, it'd be every week. And then you're pretty much every day. And those cycles are like, it's good, but it's not great. It's good, but it's okay, go away and don't sleep, figure it out, come back, And if it doesn't get to great, okay, maybe we don't do that, which is always 9 things out of 10 die around Apple because what they put out is great. So the things they decide not to do are often better than things that other people do. So there's that very high bar. And so a little bit that's process of working that I learned from him, which was constantly making it better and better and better. And if it doesn't get to great, then maybe you put it aside and do something else, which is the painful thing you have to do. I describe that as passionate detachment. You have to be super passionate, but also recognize that probably 9 things out of 10 are going to die. So tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up, start again, punch in, and, get going again. So you have to be detached from your idea, but be passionate while it's alive. So that's easier said than done, and probably learned over iTunes and iPod and iPhone and App Store and iPad. And so when I went after that to work with Brian Chesky, I went to work at Airbnb with him, and we launched the Trips platform together in 2016. I brought a lot of those principles with me. We built a keynote which looked like an Apple presentation, and Brian's a friend. He was on my podcast last year, and a great fellow, great designer, great product builder, really builds for good human interaction. And you can't say that about many founders. So I think Airbnb is in general a great community. That's become our practice. So I would credit with a fair volume of teaching me how to do that. There must have been something in me that was able to learn it, because the guys before me all got fired. So I don't know how I lasted for 11 years, but somehow.
Yeah, because I read that when you joined and started to work with Steve, the 3 people before you were fired after 1 month, right? Was it correct?
I don't know whether that's entirely true, but something like that. I mean, someone said to me something like that. I didn't discover who the 3 people were, but there was one guy who I think only lasted 1 meeting actually. And he's like, I want to show you this presentation. And Steve's like, okay. And he starts, so anyway, we did this thing and we're thinking about the thing. And he's like, just one question. How many slides are in this presentation? And the guy said, 72. He's like, okay, let's go straight to 72. I'm pretty quick. Like, And I learned never to make a presentation to Steve of 72 slides. So if you can't get it on one board or two boards, or this, some ideas, some visuals, some words, I had boards, and it was kind of in a physical world where digital tools weren't there 25 years ago. But I would create charts of ideas and visualization of things. A very visual thinker, as you would imagine, since he created the Macintosh, right? Where computing went to become a creative tool, whereas the guys at Microsoft and Dell and Hewlett-Packard before, those people, it was a computing tool for people that didn't care about aesthetics, and Macintosh created that. So the computer became a tool for creativity, and the screen is the thing in between you and it. Use your finger. So I think learning how to interact with him as I always think that he was so special because he both had EQ and IQ in equal measure. So what I mean by that is super smart, can build computers and software and those things and understands technology, but has the EQ to understand the human condition, has the feeling of what humans want. And maybe I have a tiny, tiny little bit of that myself.
You touch on so many things I want to follow up. Maybe the first one that really stood apart is how iterative is the process to come up with, good stories and so on. It's never something I see in product companies. They come up with products. This can take weeks or months. Then this is usually handed over to marketing or communication or, whatever. And then it goes out to the world. But clearly what you just said is that it could take months to build, a keynote. Like, was it a process which was developed in parallel to product development? Did you interface with the product teams? Like, how did you drive this iterative process, basically?
So, often the beginning of the process was, James, come with me, let's go down to Johnny's design studio and let's look at this new device or new thing, and so this was a moment of real hardware innovation, and then the software innovation and the integration of it, which is what Apple is all about, that experience. So, I think that Apple's methodology is those reps of constantly cycles of improvement. If I imagined Johnny Ive's studio, it's a cloth on a wooden table. You pull the cloth off and there's 100 models of iPods, and Steve and Johnny would go, wait, I don't think this button is quite right. I think we need to, I like that one a little bit, but but no, we haven't quite figured out how, okay, well, let's keep working on that, just over and over. And I'd be like, I think I can see the difference, because I wasn't building the product, I was doing the marketing. My job was to see the infinitesimal difference in an edit. I would show him a film that might be used in a keynote or a commercial or whatever on a website. And Steve would say to me, you changed the edit and shaved some frames. And I'm like, I know, and back in the day, I was sending him a low-res QuickTime, right? So if you remember what they were, because you had to do that to share things, right? You didn't really have the bandwidth to do anything else. And you lose frames with a low-res QuickTime, right? But that's the only thing that can communicate with the way that the bandwidth was back then and the way the technology was. But he would always spot where the frames have been removed, and I would, like, at the beginning of the process, I'd be like, no, we didn't change that. He's like, I think you should check with your editor because you did. And to the naked eye, I didn't see the difference. And I call the editor and he's like, I kind of had to lose a few frames. And I'm like, if you do that, you tell me about it, Because Steve's like, oh, I told you to lose some frames. I'm like, oh, God. So it's that incredible eye for detail that, and it's a different world today in some ways. And software is, of course, different to hardware in that, you sort of beta test. It's beta versus meta a little bit, right? So meta is like, oh my God, this product's did you see this iPod with the click wheel? It's amazing, and it's absolutely perfect, right? So their products are just, beta is a bit more like throw it out there, see what happens, get people's involved, and so, and I think, so it's a slightly different era in terms of Apple's perfectionism. But I think everyone can learn from that approach to constant iteration, constant improvement. Whether you're putting it out in the public and then make, and trying it and making it better, or whether you're holding it back and then releasing it, which is the Apple strategy. And then everybody's always like, wow, Apple's done it again. It's completely different from anything before. Depends on what kind of company you want to be, and I see value in both. Like I've worked with, of course, in the last 5 years with Founder, we've worked with more than 100 founders, and many, many, many of them are following a strategy of more putting it out in beta, getting feedback, on Reddit, on Discord or whatever you get, and you have user groups, you have feedback on what's working and what's not working, and in the use of it, you learn so much more. So they both can be, but for me, it's just about never quite being satisfied and always making.
How do you realize when the thing is great? Because that's the next question. Like, okay, you go on, you keep bouncing ideas. You have this philosophy of like speaking up, right? Throwing stuff at each other. I remember you told me this concept of like also catching ideas in the air before they vanished, right? How do you know when it's a great narrative, and what's also the relationship between the first ideas and the one that come after? Because I remember you also told me that the motto, there is an app for that, actually was one of the first things you guys used to say. Then you bounce other ideas and then you came back to it. You were like, oh, that thing is actually the most sticky and the most natural. What's really the thought process there? Like, is it like an 80-20 where usually the good idea pops up really fast and then you have to just layer the cream on the cake, or is it like always challenge?
I'll start with a Johnny Ive quote. So ideas are fragile, and the whether ideas live or die depends on the people in the room as to when they come on. So the first rule is keep it small, keep it people that know what a good idea is, and I know that might sound like a very subjective thing, but people who share your values, who have a sense of what good to great is, right? And so a little bit of experience, but not necessarily, I think it's people that are very discriminating in terms of, and honest and brutally clear with themselves about what great can be. I think it's people that have creative flair, and a product understanding. So somewhere in that sort of between technology and the liberal arts, is like understanding how humans are going to use it and love it, and understanding whether it's a great product idea. With stories, honestly, oftentimes I think people try to create something that's one of the things Steve used to say to us is, don't be afraid of inevitable. The kind of thoughts I just told you, 1,000 songs in your pocket, is that an idea? Is that like oh my God, It's just, you're like, oh, that's cool. There's an app for that. Kind of cool. Simple. I get it. It's familiar, 99 cents for your favorite song. Don't go there, live there for Airbnb. We don't have to use Apple all day long. Real friends for Snapchat. I remember presenting that to Evan Spiegel because, in social media, a lot of people are lying to strangers, right? That was the first thing I said to him, right? It's, you don't have 15,000 friends and you didn't have a good day because you posted a picture of the sunset, right? Or your happy family when you're not happy. That doesn't right? That's not good human behavior for you. So lying to strangers is not healthy. Trying to separate itself from more toxic environments, and I was like, you're really just about real friends. I snapped him real friends like the end of our third meeting or something. And 2 years later, we did a campaign and just said real friends. So I think, is real friends an idea? Yeah, it's an idea. And obviously it's not just the line, but it's everything you surround it with. And real friends is an idea because, friendship was a thing touted by other social media platforms who will be remain nameless. But it turned out they weren't your friends, and it was kind of toxic, and it wasn't healthy, and it wasn't constructive. Whereas if you design something that is ephemeral, that goes away, that only your 10 to 15 friends, and you're really honest on it, then maybe it is real friends. So I think the idea has to live up to the product or service experience. It has to live up to it. So the idea doesn't live out on its own. It's like, oh my God, that was a great ad or poster, and then you go use the product and you're like, what were they thinking? I have no idea what you're talking about. Hopefully the ideas that good companies do is you look at that and you go, oh yeah, I get it. And then you go, oh, I see what you're saying. You walk in an Apple store and you go, yeah, That's right. You open a box and you try and open the iPhone box in any less than 3 minutes. You're like, okay, that's everything just, thought about, very careful, And so I think ideas have to capture the sort of existential nature of the entire company. And that's in a way why what I do now and have done for the last 10 years is not really branding and marketing. It's much more about the existential story of the company. Because the work we do, we worked for a year with Jason at Discord on products. We work with Patreon on internal values that need to be reflected in creative culture. And so it's about making sure the storytelling isn't what I might say lipstick on a pig. It's kind of not a great thing, but let's put a nice bit of marketing over top. This is about what's the story that really reflects the values, the experience that you're going to have. And that becomes resonant. So that's a great idea where you absolutely go, oh, wow. And then you go on the product and you go, I see what they meant. I really see what they meant. And now it has even more layers, right? Because if you think about it, I don't know what it is. I think David from Roblox, when we worked with him in 2018, he said to me, James, 93%, I don't know, I just made that up. 93% of people's relationship with a company is through using it. And the ad they see every now and again, or some poster or some press release, or, it's tiny. Maybe it's 98%. But people use Roblox every day, right? And they're in and out, or Discord or Snap, or every day. And so if you're going to put out a message, make sure it's validated every single minute and reinforces the reality of using the product or experience.
Wow. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I actually like the deep connection between the regular usage. I think this is, I also feel that I've heard many times that actually the product is a positioning, the product is a story. So I think that's...
Yeah. Well, I think, I think Apple is the sort of the best product company the world's ever seen, in that that's the real focus. And then the marketing is in service of the product. But the product is as well thought through and criticized and killed, and judgments of 9 things out of 10 dying because it's not good enough. That's the bar for the products. The product arrives and the storytelling has to because it's already a story, as you said, they have the person in mind, There's a great, I was just reminded recently in 2012, just a year after Steve passed away, I did a video, which you can probably find on YouTube. It's called Designed by Apple in California. Maybe you want to share it on the podcast or not, whatever. But it's beautiful because it asks Apple designs. And they talk about how do we want people to feel? What is the message we want to pass them? How do we want them to respond? And then we go about finding the perfect way to build that product. And so it's sort of about how they design physically and from a hardware and a software point of view, how they design with intention. And I think that's a process that I think for product market people is super important, whether you're on either side of hardware.
100%. Yeah, they're very known for, there is this one famous trick they had with, basically they would half close the laptop, the MacBook Pro in the Apple store, so that when you come, you kind of push up the screen to use or try the MacBook. And this would actually help people understand the device, because the resistance, just of that screen being pushed backward already tells a lot about the quality of the materials and the story that Apple tries to tell.
Yeah. Actually, there's another reference to that very point, Enzo. We launched the MacBook, and it was MacBook Air, and it was super thin, right? 2007, or I don't know, making it up. I don't know. Mm-hmm. And the ad was simply an envelope, one of those brown office manila envelopes. We just put it down and then pulled this computer out, and everyone's like, you didn't say a word. You're like, and then Steve came up in the keynote with a manila envelope and pulled it out. I mean, you don't need to say anything. It's like Steve pulling the iPhone out of his pocket or the iPod out of his, you're like, I don't need to tell you it's small, so the less you can say, the better, And so designing the products and then thinking about the way you can see or show it. With iPad, we always had people with their feet up, which is kind of silly in a way. I don't know whether that's an idea, but we are helping you understand how to use it. Lean back, enjoy, It's a big screen, you know?
I remember really well the envelope. It was my first MacBook. It came out, he really had a good sense of the show. I think it was great for that too.
Yeah.
Talking about expanding the message, one more personal product I bought was the first iPod for U2, which was red and black. And I think it was also one of the first color screen iPod. I think I read that you worked on this one. Did you?
Yeah, it's a kind of funny story. I think it's in the Steve Jobs book, so if you're interested in the story, but I'll give you the short version. Yeah, we were going, so we had, with iPod, done a whole bunch of music because we were trying to also talk about discovery on iTunes because nobody knew what iTunes was. It's this digital place where you get music, and now, of course, everybody's got Spotify and blah, blah, blah. But so you understand the concept. But before, music was CDs, right? Which is hard to get your head around. To digitize something didn't make sense to most people. So we're trying to introduce this concept of iTunes, discovery on iTunes. So we found all these amazing bands no one had ever heard of. Jet, Wolfmother, Gorillaz, like all this amazing music. I used to be a DJ and a drummer, so I was like, had all these music supervisors and kind of forced me to do cool music, which was amazing. And so we got into some fun fights around that. We got Coldplay, and the night before, Steve's like, oh, I think Coldplay are done. I'm like, no, you don't. You're just pushing me. So, but the U2 story, so we were working with them and going to shoot them, and they were going to be the first they were the biggest band in the world, right, around that time, 2003, 2004, something like that. So if we got endorsement from U2, it was basically the industry saying, okay, you know, this is good. And so I'd been to London and shot Bono and The Edge and the rest of the crew very humbly. And we came back, and one day I spoke to him, and he said, nah, I don't think we're going to do this. I think it's off. I'm like, okay. He's like, so I called Steve, and he's like, yeah, you know, I just don't think we can agree on the terms. They're being difficult and da-da-da. And I'm like, well, do you mind if I call him? He's like, I mean, there's no point, but yeah, sure. Why don't you call him? So I remember it was a Saturday night. I was in LA, and he was in Dublin, where he's from. And I stayed up late so that I could call him at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. So it's 2 a.m, Saturday night. So I go to a party, come back, sit there waiting. I think my wife's still at the party. And so I call him, and he's like, oh, I'm just on the phone with The Edge. Hold on, James, let me I'm like, oh, God, no, don't hang up on The Edge, you know. Anyway, so we got on the phone, and I'm like, what's going on? He said, well, you know, it's really simple for us, James. Like, we only have one thing to give. It's our music. It's the one thing we love and the one thing we have currency. We always said to our fans we wouldn't do naff things for music, right? For money. And but I don't, you know, he said, I don't feel like it's an equal exchange. And I said, well, what if we did the same thing for you? What if we gave you the one thing we love? And of course, I knew that we had this red and black iPod, and I knew that Vertigo was red and black. Mm-hmm. And I'm like calling Johnny in between. I'm like, you have a red and black iPod? He's like, yeah, say so. I'm like, do you like a U2? He's like, I love U2. I saw them in Hull in 1980. And I'm like, great, I'm going to put you on with Bono. Is that cool? He said, yeah, I'd love to talk to Bono. And like, anyway, I don't know what, it's 20 years ago, but I think it was something like this. So then I say to him, you know, what if we give you an iPod that is the color of your album, Vertigo, black and red? And what if we said we'd never do it with any other artist? And he's like, are you kidding? He said, that's the gift I want to give to my fans. That's the gift of you giving us the thing you care about the most, which is the product. So, you know, and then I'm like, oh shit, what did I do? I obviously committed to something that I wasn't probably allowed to. So I'm backpedaling with Steve and like, you know, maybe remember that iPod that we saw? What if we get, you know, what if da-da-da? Anyway, so blah, blah, blah. And obviously I didn't do the deal, they did the deal and whatever, but it was just some conversations. I think Johnny flew over on Steve's jet and hung out with Bono, and Bono called and said, Johnny's in the bathroom pleading for mercy. And if you hadn't called me in the middle of the night from LA, we wouldn't be sitting here with this beautiful object. So it was just a little moment where I was able to like put two pieces together. I didn't put the whole deal together, of course, and that turned into something quite big. You two were important, and people like you saw the iPod as something super relevant. And, you know, I'm sure you're a bit of a U2 fan, so you didn't mind it too.
And again, I think that's a great example of, you know, connecting a product with something that people already knew, right? A habit they had, or a band they had a connection with, or a message they already were familiar with. And Bono was very involved back then, I remember, in charity. So he had also a very good I don't know if you say that, like not reputation, but like aura in a way.
Yeah. No, for sure. No, he was a very good spokesman for it.
Maybe one last question to wrap up the Apple chapter. How would you work differently at Apple knowing what you know today?
Oh, if I went back there today? Wow, that's a good question. I probably just wouldn't make as many mistakes in having to learn the things that I figured out by the end. But, some of them are just constant resilience and constantly picking yourself up and finding new inspiration. And so, whether in my 50s I would have the tenacity to work 18-hour days for 11 years, I'm not sure. But if you took the 55-year-old brain and put it in the 35-year-old body, I could probably just get there a little quicker. But then again, some of the rawness of the way that we worked was also, I think, came out in the work that we produced. The Silhouettes campaign was just really raw and really memorable. It changed what Apple, the brand, was all about. Apple before that was all white background, say hello to the iPod, right? Say hello to this, say it. And I'm like, we can't say hello again. Like, come on. We're always going to say, okay, well, let's say hello, but let's do something else too. Like, let's make this a cultural. And of course, that became the pressure to make it very cultural. And we iconicized the product, so it became white, and it wasn't really the product. It was like a white blob. I'm never going to use a white blob, But in the end, you were just emotionally attracted to this energy that was coming off these Silhouette boards in every major city, Paris or London or everywhere. This dancing that happens with this incredible energy. And you were pulled into, and of course we were teaching you how to use a small device in your pocket. Right? Cut to 5 years later, and most people, right, had already got the iPod behavior down with earphones, right, that used to be cords. And so when this came along, we'd already the iPod became the iPhone. And of course it did a lot more. There was a single use case, but it was the right use case because I'm very emotional about my music. People love music. I love music. You love music. And so you get this really positive affiliation with having a device in your pocket. Is super useful. And so there were some things we had to teach people, but one of them wasn't like, how do I use a device in my pocket to do things? And then just make the brand cultural. So I think some of my youth and maybe naivety helped in some ways in that situation.
Probably. And also the environment you were in, and the time also, like everything that was happening in the world at that time. I think all of that played a big role. It's very inspiring.
Yeah.
So that's recently. So something we didn't mention is that recently you've started to be the guest host on a podcast from Fast Company called the Most Innovative Companies podcast. And I know you're hosting amazing people. You mentioned Brian Chesky, among others. Could you share with us one thing that you learned that was mind-blowing, maybe from one of your guests that doesn't really belong to the Apple era? Something very different, maybe a completely different perspective on one thing, and you're like, I was wrong. This is the way to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many of those. Obviously, I'm going to say that so that everybody goes and listens to the podcast series. But there were 12 different. And there's actually one podcast where myself and my partners at Founders, so there's 4 of us, and they're all equally sort of brilliant at the thing that they do. One's a storyteller, one's a strategist, one's an entrepreneur. And we did a partner session about all the things that we'd learned. So in that, we talked about all the themes that had sort of pulled together. I had Jose from Farfetch. I had Patrick from Sonos. I had Brian Chesky from Airbnb. I had Joe from Titan. I had Irving from Bowery Farms, who does hydroponic foods, and all of them shared some very similar characteristics, but they brought themselves to it, right? And I think maybe what we're talking about here is the sort of ID of what a founder, great founder. Oh, they're mostly great founders. They're all great founders. Sorry. There's obviously some sense of a vision for something that isn't the world as it is today. and they have a resilience around that, which is not a small thing to say. I have a belief that the world could be different that I keep having over and over and over again, and I'm willing to work through. Like you could have a belief one evening after a couple of bottles of wine, and then you have a different belief. So there's a vision of the world that doesn't exist today. There's resilience in constantly, relentlessly working on that. For me, there was the ones that, I try to pattern recognize great founders that bring kind of the head and the heart to decisions. I think obviously that's kind of a Steve thing, the technology and the human condition, EQ plus IQ, head and heart, like bring both the logic and the emotion to the conversation. For me, those are the most interesting founders. Those are the ones that make positive dents in the universe. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the Brian Chesky podcast was incredible. And I think he said a couple of things that were great. And he's actually gone on to say more in other places since. One is, why aren't there enough creative people running companies? Because when they do a great job. And the second one, he said, that was really terrific. I mean, the guy is from RISD, right? He's a designer. And so he's creative. He designs for good human interaction. And so if you think about Airbnb, let's just think about it on a personal level, right? So take it out of the theoretical. When you go on Airbnb, you go, oh, I want to go to Barcelona, right? I'm traveling with my family and, it is a really nice place. So you send a little note to the person with the really nice place and you say, hey, I'm in Barcelona with my little family. Your house looks amazing. I'd love to stay there. And of course, they go check your reviews and you've been good because you care and you're a nice person. And so you bring a good human to Airbnb. It's just an atmosphere that you wouldn't even dream of being how you are on TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor is like, oh, that was shit. Oh, I hated that. The cappuccino was cold. Like, it's a place to moan, right? And all the place to moan. But you know what I mean? The reviews on there can sometimes get to that space, and social media suffers from that many times. I think Airbnb's done a good job of the world's largest community-driven super brand, created mostly by hosts who are just you and me that happen to have a spare room or a place. And we rent it out to other humans. And that interaction between the hosts and the guests is managed really thoughtfully and carefully. And the atmosphere is thought about. In Airbnb, when I worked there for a couple of years, it'd be like, who's hosting this meeting? Oh, yeah, I brought cookies and there's coffee and there's, so you have to learn the practice of hosting, And then, but when, as you're thinking about being on Airbnb at the end, right, you stayed there, you're in Barcelona for a week, like, this was great. I had one little problem, but I called them and they fixed it. And okay, but, I wish the problem hadn't happened, right? And so, of course, it's life and things go wrong. So how are you going to deal with that? On TripAdvisor, you'd say, well, that was shitty and, But at Airbnb, you do a private review first. And the private review, and you're constantly encouraged to have dialogue with it. So, you know what? There's a leaking bathroom, or there's no this, and the boiler doesn't work, or whatever, right? Okay, let me come around and fix it. Or, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Or do you want an extra nut? Whatever the thing is. And you have that interaction. And the first review you do is private. So you say, Enzo, I loved your place, but there were a couple of problems. So I just want to tell you about it. Can you fix them? Or can you help me with it? And you also, because you also want to create a good human interaction. You want good reviews. You want people to say it's a good, right? And so it's elevating this interaction. It also improves the product. Feedback goes directly to you, Enzo, to improve your bathroom, right? So you go fix it so that you don't get that review again. So product always gets better and better. But whatever discourse happens, anything that's kind of a little toxic gets pulled out in the private review. And then when you go do the public review, you say, I had a great stay. There were a couple of issues, but they sorted them out. And so Brian's thought is that you can design for good human interaction. And if you design thoughtfully and intentionally, you can get humans to interact with each other well. And of course, there's plenty of platforms where, I think that was a great revelation to me. And, it's not, Airbnb is not unlike an experiential version of Apple in a way, 20 years later. It's not unlike it. You squint your eyes and you feel some of the values. And I think Brian, he's not Steve, but has some of the attributes of him.
That's a great conclusion. And I've seen that it's interesting to mention really the impact of design, because for me, design is broad, right? It's not only like the screen or whether there is like leave a private message. It's like even like the tone of the platform, the UX copywriting, or, like the kind of the community they built from the very beginning. I think all of that played a really big impact for them. And it's definitely missing some further explanation around there for that. Like it's not very well theorized. People don't really, put the right words on this thing. We're getting at the end. I know you have follow-up meetings. You're a very busy person. Thank you so much for coming.
It's been a pleasure. I enjoyed your questions. I'm often sitting on the other side, so I'm going to celebrate your ability to keep provoking with great questions. So it was a really fun chat, and I enjoyed it very much. Hopefully the listeners liked it too.
They will, for sure. It was a great episode with you. If people want to follow you or engage with you, where should they find you?
It's just FNDR.co is us. And then, the Fast Company, most innovative. They were last summer. So there were like 12 episodes that I guest hosted, and there've been some others since then. So you have to go back to last summer. But I'm doing another set in September. So look out for those.
Great news. I'll point to that. Thank you so much. Have a good one, James.
Thank you for listening to the June podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe. This episode is powered by June. For a better way to do product analytics, visit june.so.